The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the small cottage on Willow Lane. Irene Walsh opened her eyes at exactly 6 o'clock, as she had done every morning for the past 15 years. She did not need an alarm clock anymore. Her body had learned the rhythm of Greendale, the small English town that had become her home. She sat up slowly in bed, feeling the familiar ache in her lower back. 65 years had left their marks on her body, but she did not complain. She had learned long ago that complaining changed nothing. Instead, she stood up, stretched her arms above her head, and walked to the window. Outside, Willow Lane was still quiet. The street lamps were beginning to fade as dawn approached. Mrs. Patterson's tabby cat walked along the garden wall. Mr. Davies' newspaper lay on his doorstep. Everything was as it should be. Everything was safe and predictable. Irene smiled. This was exactly what she wanted. This was exactly what she needed. She went downstairs to her small kitchen and put the kettle on. While waiting for the water to boil, she looked around the room. Everything here was simple and old-fashioned. No fancy gadgets, no complicated machines. Just a kettle, a toaster, and a small radio that she never turned on. The walls were painted a soft cream color. There were no photographs on display. No pictures of family or friends, just a calendar from the local church and a watercolor painting of the Yorkshire Dales that she had bought at a charity shop. This was how Irene lived now. Simply, quietly, invisibly. The kettle whistled and she made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the small wooden table and drank it slowly, watching the sky grow lighter outside her window. She thought about the day ahead. It would be like every other day, and that was exactly how she liked it. At 7 o'clock, Irene washed her cup and climbed the stairs to get dressed. She put on her usual clothes, comfortable trousers, a plain blouse, and a warm cardigan. She brushed her gray hair and tied it back in a simple bun. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the bathroom sink. The woman looking back at her was ordinary. Average height, average build, with a kind face and gentle blue eyes. She wore no makeup. She had no expensive jewelry. She looked exactly like what she wanted to appear. A quiet, retired woman living a simple life. But when she looked into her own eyes, Irene could see something else. Something she tried to hide every day. Something that still frightened her, even after all these years. She could see the shadow of who she used to be. The shadow of Irene Walsh from London. The shadow of a woman who had lived a completely different life. She looked away from the mirror quickly. That woman did not exist anymore. That woman had died 15 years ago. The woman who existed now was just the butcher's assistant in Greendale. Nothing more, nothing less. At 7:30, Irene left her cottage and walked down Willow Lane toward the town center. She passed Mrs. Patterson, who was putting out her rubbish bins. "Good morning, Irene," Mrs. Patterson called out cheerfully. "Lovely morning, isn't it?" "Good morning, Dorothy," Irene replied with a warm smile. "Yes, it looks like it might be a nice day." "Will you be at the church coffee morning on Saturday?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "We're raising money for the new playground equipment." "Of course," Irene said. "I'll bring some scones." Mrs. Patterson beamed. "Wonderful. Your scones are always the first to go." Irene continued her walk, greeting other neighbors as she went. Mr. Davies collecting his newspaper. Young Sarah Mitchell walking her dog. Old Mr. Thompson slowly making his way to the post office with his walking stick. Everyone knew Irene in Greendale. Everyone liked her. She was helpful, friendly, and always had time for a chat. She helped elderly neighbors with their shopping. She volunteered at the church. She attended community events. She was, in every way, a perfect member of the community. And that was exactly what she had worked so hard to become. Irene reached the high street just before 8 o'clock. The shops were beginning to open. The baker was putting fresh bread in his window. The newsagent was arranging magazines on the display stand outside his shop. The charity shop was putting out rails of donated clothes. At the end of the high street stood Jenkins' butcher shop, with its green and white striped awning and its old-fashioned painted sign. Irene had worked here for 15 years, ever since she had arrived in Greendale. It was her anchor, her routine, her safe place. She took out her key and unlocked the side door. Inside, the shop smelled of fresh meat and sawdust. Everything was clean and neat. Tom Jenkins, the owner, was very particular about cleanliness. He said that a good butcher's shop should smell of meat, not blood. Irene put on her white apron and began preparing for the day. She arranged the display case, checking that everything looked attractive. She set out the price labels. She made sure the scales were ready. She had done these same tasks every morning for 15 years, and she knew exactly what needed to be done. At 8:30, Tom Jenkins arrived through the back door. He was a big man in his early 50s, with red cheeks and strong hands. He had owned the butcher shop for 25 years, taking it over from his father. "Morning, Irene," he called out cheerfully. "How are you today?" "Very well, thank you, Tom," Irene replied. "The lamb chops look particularly good this morning." Tom came to inspect the display case and nodded with satisfaction. "Aye, beautiful meat from Johnson's farm. I picked it up yesterday afternoon. Should sell well today." They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing for opening time. Tom went into the back room to cut some beef, while Irene finished setting up the shop front. They had developed an easy working relationship over the years. Tom did the heavy work and the cutting. Irene handled the customers and kept everything organized. At 9 o'clock exactly, Irene unlocked the front door and turned the sign to open. Within minutes, the first customers began to arrive. Mrs. Henderson came in first, as she did every Tuesday morning. She was a plump woman in her 70s who lived alone and liked to chat. "Good morning, Irene, dear," she said. "Isn't it a lovely day?" "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Irene replied warmly. "What can I get for you today?" "Oh, just my usual, 2 pork chops and some bacon for the weekend. Are those pork chops nice and thick?" "Very thick," Irene assured her. "Tom selected them specially this morning." While Irene wrapped the meat, Mrs. Henderson talked about her garden, her television programs, and her grandson who lived in Manchester. Irene listened patiently, making appropriate comments at the right moments. This was part of her job too, not just selling meat, but being a friendly face in the community. Throughout the morning, a steady stream of customers came and went. Some were regulars who came every week. Others were occasional shoppers. Irene knew them all by name. She knew what they usually bought. She knew about their families and their lives. This knowledge had taken years to accumulate, but it was valuable. It made her part of the community. It made her belong. Around 11 o'clock, a young woman came into the shop. Irene recognized her as Emma Foster, who had recently moved to Greendale with her husband and baby daughter. "Hello, Emma," Irene said with a friendly smile. "How are you settling in?" Emma looked pleased to be remembered. "Oh, hello! We're settling in wonderfully, thank you. Everyone has been so welcoming." "I'm glad to hear it. What can I get for you today?" "I'm making a stew for dinner. What would you recommend?" Irene showed her some chuck steak, explaining how to cook it slowly for the best results. Emma listened carefully, thanking her for the advice. As Irene wrapped the meat, Emma's baby started to fuss in the pram. "Oh dear," Emma said. "She's probably hungry." "She's beautiful," Irene said, glancing at the baby. "How old is she now?" 6 months, Emma replied proudly. "Growing so fast." After Emma left, Irene stood for a moment, looking out the shop window. She watched the young mother pushing the pram down the street, stopping to talk to another neighbor. Irene felt a familiar emptiness inside her chest. She had no children, no family, no one who would remember her when she was gone. But that was the price she had paid for peace. That was the price she had paid for safety. And most days, she believed it was worth it. The morning passed quickly. At 1 o'clock, Tom told Irene to take her lunch break. She went to the small tea room on the high street where she always ordered the same thing: a cheese sandwich and a cup of tea. The tea room was run by Helen Grant, a cheerful woman in her 40s who knew everyone's business. Irene sat at her usual table by the window and ate her sandwich slowly, watching people walk past outside. "Everything all right, Irene?" Helen asked, stopping by her table to collect empty cups from another customer. "Yes, thank you, Helen. Lovely sandwich, as always." "You should try our new lemon cake," Helen suggested. "I made it fresh this morning." "Maybe tomorrow," Irene said with a smile. But she knew she would not try the lemon cake tomorrow. She would order the same cheese sandwich and tea that she always ordered. Routine was safe. Routine was predictable. Routine kept her grounded in this simple life she had built. After lunch, Irene returned to the butcher shop for the afternoon shift. The afternoon was usually quieter than the morning. Fewer customers came in. This gave Irene time to clean, organize the stockroom, and help Tom with administrative tasks. Around 3 o'clock, old Mr. Thompson came into the shop, leaning heavily on his walking stick. He was 92 years old and lived alone in a small flat above the hardware store. "Hello, Mr. Thompson," Irene said warmly. "What brings you in today?" "Just need some mints for my tea," Mr. Thompson said in his shaky voice. "Half a pound will do." Irene prepared his order carefully. She knew that Mr. Thompson struggled with money. His pension did not go far, so she always made sure to give him a little extra and never charged him for it. "There you are," she said, handing him the package. "That's £2.20, please." Mr. Thompson slowly counted out the coins from his worn leather purse. His hands shook slightly as he placed them on the counter. "You're a good woman, Irene," he said, looking at her with watery blue eyes. "Always fair, always kind." "It's just good business, Mr. Thompson," Irene replied gently. But as she watched the old man slowly make his way out of the shop, she felt that familiar warmth in her chest. This was why she had come to Greendale. This was what made her life worthwhile now. These small acts of kindness, these simple human connections. It was not the life she had planned. It was not the life she had worked for. But it was a good life. It was a peaceful life. And after everything that had happened, peace was all she wanted. The afternoon continued quietly. At 5:30, Irene helped Tom close up the shop. They cleaned the display case, put away the remaining meat in the cold room, and swept the floor. By 6 o'clock, everything was locked up and secure. "See you tomorrow, Irene," Tom said as they parted ways outside the shop. "See you tomorrow, Tom," Irene replied. She walked slowly back to Willow Lane as the sun began to set. The sky was painted in beautiful shades of pink and orange. Some people were returning home from work, others were walking their dogs. Children played in their gardens. Life in Greendale continued its gentle, predictable rhythm. When Irene reached her cottage, she made herself a simple dinner, scrambled eggs on toast and a cup of tea. She ate alone at her kitchen table, looking out at her small back garden. The garden was neat and tidy, with vegetables growing in careful rows. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just practical and simple, like everything else in her life. After dinner, Irene washed her dishes by hand. She did not have a dishwasher. She did not have a microwave. She did not even have a mobile phone. These modern conveniences held no appeal for her. In fact, they made her uncomfortable. They reminded her too much of her old life. As evening fell, Irene sat in her small living room and read a book from the library. She liked simple novels about ordinary people living ordinary lives. No complex plots, no technology, no financial intrigue. Just gentle stories about communities and relationships and everyday problems. At 10 o'clock, she went to bed. Tomorrow would be another day just like this one, and the day after that would be the same again. This was her life now. This was her choice. As she closed her eyes, Irene felt the familiar mixture of relief and sadness that she carried with her every day. Relief that she was safe here in Greendale, hidden away from her past. Sadness for the woman she used to be, the life she used to have, the dreams she used to dream. But those dreams had turned into nightmares. That life had destroyed her, and that woman had ceased to exist. Now there was only Irene Walsh, the butcher's assistant. Nothing more, nothing less. And that was exactly how it needed to be. 15 years ago, Irene Walsh had been a completely different person. She had lived in London, in a smart apartment in Canary Wharf. She had worked for Sentinel Financial Solutions, one of the leading financial technology companies in Europe. She had been their senior software security architect, responsible for designing and maintaining the security systems that protected billions of pounds. Back then, Irene's life had been fast-paced and demanding. She would wake at 5 in the morning and go for a run along the Thames. She would be at her desk by 7, working on complex code and security protocols. She would attend meetings with bank executives and technology directors. She would review system updates and threat assessments. She would work until late in the evening, sometimes not leaving the office until 9 or 10 at night. Irene had loved her work. She had been passionate about it. She was brilliant at what she did. She understood financial systems in a way that few people did. She could see vulnerabilities that others missed. She could write code that was elegant, efficient, and almost impossible to break. Her colleagues had respected her. Her managers had valued her. She had earned a very good salary. She had traveled internationally for conferences and consultations. She had been at the top of her field, and she had been proud of what she did. She believed she was making the financial world safer. She believed she was protecting ordinary people from fraud and theft. She believed she was using her intelligence and skills for good. She had been so naive. It had all started with a new project. Sentinel Financial Solutions had won a major contract with the International Banking Consortium. They needed a new integrated payment processing system that would handle transactions across multiple countries and currencies. It was a massive project worth millions of pounds. The system would be used by hundreds of banks and would process thousands of transactions every second. Irene had been appointed as the lead security architect for the project. It was the biggest opportunity of her career. She had thrown herself into the work with enthusiasm and dedication. She had designed a sophisticated security system with multiple layers of protection. Encryption protocols, authentication systems, monitoring algorithms, fraud detection mechanisms. Everything she could think of to make the system safe. She had worked on the project for 3 years. Long hours, weekends, holidays. She had given everything to make it perfect. Her team had been talented and committed. Together, they had built something remarkable. The system had launched successfully. Banks across Europe had begun using it. Billions of pounds were being processed through the platform every day. Everything seemed to be working perfectly. Irene had been proud. Her managers had praised her work. She had received a substantial bonus. There had even been talk of a promotion to Chief Technology Officer. And then, 6 months after the launch, everything had collapsed. It started with a news report. A journalist had discovered that money was disappearing from the system. Not large amounts that would trigger alerts, small amounts. A few pounds here, a few euros there. Taken from thousands of accounts, accumulated over months, totaling millions. At first, Irene's company had denied everything. They said it was impossible. Their system was secure. The journalist must be mistaken. But then, more evidence emerged. More journalists started investigating. More victims came forward. People who had noticed small, unexplained withdrawals from their accounts. Always small amounts. Always made to look like legitimate fees or charges. The scandal exploded across the media. Every day brought new headlines. Massive banking fraud. Millions stolen through security flaw. International banking system compromised. Investigators were called in. Police, financial regulators, independent security experts. They examined the system that Irene had built. They analyzed the code she had written. And they discovered the truth. Someone had modified Irene's code. Someone with high-level access had inserted small changes into the security protocols. These changes created a hidden back door that allowed money to be diverted without triggering any alarms. The modifications were subtle and sophisticated. They looked like legitimate system code. Only someone with deep technical knowledge could have made them. The authorities found evidence pointing to several people at Sentinel Financial Solutions, senior managers, system administrators, people with access to the core code. A criminal conspiracy within the company itself. But because Irene had written the original code, and because she had been the lead architect, suspicion fell heavily on her. Some people believed she must have been involved. How could someone modify her code without her knowing? How could such changes be made without her authorization? Irene had been questioned repeatedly by police, by investigators, by her own company's internal security team. They had examined every aspect of her life, her finances, her communications, her computer activity. They had found nothing to implicate her. She had not been part of the conspiracy. She had not received any of the stolen money. She had been a victim of people she had trusted. But the damage had been done. Even though she was never charged with any crime, Irene's reputation was destroyed. Her name was all over the news, always connected to the scandal. Other technology companies would not hire her. No one wanted to be associated with the biggest financial fraud in a decade. Her friends had slowly drifted away. They did not know what to say to her. They felt uncomfortable around her. Even though she was innocent, the shadow of suspicion followed her everywhere. Irene had fallen into a deep depression. She had stopped leaving her apartment. She had stopped eating properly. She had stopped caring about anything. The work that had defined her life had been turned into a weapon against her. The skills she had been so proud of had been used to harm innocent people. Everything she had believed about herself had been proven false. She had thought about ending her life more than once. The pain had been unbearable. The humiliation, the loss of everything she had worked for. But something had stopped her. Some small spark of survival. Some tiny voice that said she deserved another chance. So instead of ending her life, Irene had decided to end the woman she had been. She had sold her London apartment. She had closed her bank accounts. She had changed her mobile phone number. She had cut ties with everyone from her old life. She had taken the small amount of money she had left and disappeared. She had chosen Greendale almost by accident. She had been driving through Yorkshire, looking for somewhere quiet and remote, somewhere far from London, somewhere no one would know her. She had seen the sign for Greendale and had turned off the main road on impulse. The town had been perfect. Small, traditional. The kind of place where nothing ever happened. The kind of place where people still knew their neighbors. The kind of place where a quiet woman could live simply and be left alone. Irene had rented the cottage on Willow Lane. She had told people she was a retired school teacher, moving to the countryside for a peaceful life. No one had questioned her story. No one had any reason to doubt her. She had needed work, but she had been determined to avoid anything connected to technology. She needed something simple, something physical, something that would not remind her of her past. When she had seen the advertisement in the post office window, "Assistant wanted at Jenkins' butcher shop," it had seemed perfect. It was as far from financial software as she could get. She had applied, and Tom Jenkins had hired her after a brief interview. And that had been her life for the past 15 years. Working in the butcher shop, living quietly in her cottage, being part of the community without ever really belonging to anyone, hiding from her past, hiding from herself. She had not touched a computer in 15 years. She had not used a smartphone. She had not engaged with technology beyond the simple till in the butcher shop. The sight of complex code or financial systems made her feel sick. The memories were too painful. She had built a safe, simple life in Greendale. She had convinced herself that she was content. She had told herself that this was enough, that she did not need anything more, that she did not want anything more. But deep inside, in a place she tried never to look, Irene knew the truth. She was not content. She was hiding. She was running. She had been running for 15 years. And some part of her knew that you could not run forever. Sooner or later, the past always caught up with you. Sooner or later, you had to face what you were running from. But not today, Irene told herself as she prepared for another ordinary day in the butcher shop. Not today. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe never. But not today. It was a bright Monday morning in late April when everything began to change. Irene was arranging the display in the butcher shop window when she saw a white van pull up outside the hardware store across the street. Two men in blue uniforms got out and began unloading equipment. "Wonder what that's about," Tom said, coming to stand beside her at the window. They watched as the men carried several large boxes into the hardware store. More vans arrived over the next hour, delivering similar boxes to shops all along the high street. During the morning, news spread quickly through Greendale. A new company called SmartPay had won a contract with the local council to upgrade all the payment systems in the town. Every shop was getting new card machines and tills. Everything would be connected to a new digital payment network. It was all part of modernizing the town and making it easier for customers to pay. Tom Jenkins was not happy about it. "I don't see why we need new machines," he grumbled. "The ones we have work perfectly well." "Perhaps the new ones will be faster," Irene suggested, though she felt uneasy about the change. "We don't need faster," Tom said stubbornly. "We need reliable. These technology companies are always trying to fix things that aren't broken." But whether Tom liked it or not, the change was happening. The council had made the decision. All businesses had to comply. The new systems would be installed within 2 weeks. Irene watched through the shop window as technicians worked their way along the high street, installing new equipment in each shop. She felt a cold anxiety building in her stomach. She had avoided technology for so long. She had kept it at arm's length. And now it was coming into her safe space, into the butcher shop that had been her refuge. "Don't worry," Tom said, noticing her expression. "I'll handle all the technical stuff. You just keep doing what you do." Irene smiled gratefully, but the anxiety did not go away. The SmartPay technicians arrived at Jenkins' butcher shop on Wednesday morning. There were 2 of them, a young man with gelled hair and a tablet computer, and an older woman with a friendly smile. "Morning," the young man said cheerfully. "We're here to install your new SmartPay system. Should only take about an hour." Tom showed them where the current till was. "Now, I want to make sure this doesn't disrupt my business," he said firmly. "I can't have the shop closed in the middle of the day." "No problem," the woman assured him. "We'll set everything up alongside your old system, then switch over when you're ready." Very smooth transition. Irene watched from a distance as the technicians unpacked their equipment. The new till was sleek and modern, with a touchscreen display. The card machine was small and wireless. Everything looked expensive and complicated. The young man noticed Irene watching. "Don't worry, it's really easy to use," he said. "Much simpler than your old system. Everything is automated." "I'm sure it's fine," Irene said quietly, turning away to serve a customer. But inside, she felt her heart beating faster. She recognized the equipment. She knew what kind of system this was. It was a networked point-of-sale system with cloud connectivity. All the transactions would be processed through a central server. All the data would be stored digitally. It was exactly the kind of system she used to design. Throughout the morning, Irene tried to focus on serving customers while the technicians worked. But she could hear them talking, using technical terms that she had not heard in years. API integration, encryption protocols, back-end database, cloud synchronization. The words brought back memories she had tried to bury. Memories of late nights in the office, writing code. Memories of system architecture diagrams and security reviews. Memories of a life she had left behind. By lunchtime, the installation was complete. The technicians showed Tom how to use the new system, how to process payments, how to generate reports, how to update prices. They made it look simple and straightforward. "See?" the young man said. "Anyone can use it. Just tap the screen, insert the card, and you're done. The system does everything else automatically." Tom nodded, though he still looked skeptical. "What if something goes wrong? What if it breaks?" "There's a customer service number you can call," the woman said, handing him a card. Someone will talk you through any problems, or we can send a technician out if needed. After the technicians left, Tom spent some time experimenting with the new till. He processed a few test transactions, printed some receipts, and checked that everything was working properly. "I suppose it's not too bad," he admitted reluctantly. "Faster than the old one, anyway." Irene said nothing. She kept her distance from the new equipment. She did not want to touch it. She did not want to get involved with it. It represented everything she had been running from. Over the next few days, all the shops in Greendale switched to the new Smart Pay system. The baker, the newsagent, the charity shop, the tea room, everyone got the same sleek new equipment. Everyone started processing payments through the same digital network. The townspeople seemed pleased with the change. Payments were indeed faster. Receipts were clearer. The system seemed to work smoothly. Within a week, everyone had adapted to the new way of doing things, except Irene. She continued to let Tom handle the till. She made excuses not to learn the new system. She stayed at the back of the shop, preparing meat and serving customers at the counter, but always letting Tom complete the transactions. Tom noticed, of course. "You should learn how to use it, Irene," he said one morning. "What if I'm not here and you need to serve customers?" "I'm sure I can manage if necessary," Irene said vaguely. "But you're so much better with these things than I am." It was a lie. And somewhere deep inside, Irene felt ashamed of lying to Tom. He was a good man. He had been kind to her for 15 years. He deserved better than lies. But the truth was impossible. She could not tell him who she really was, what she really knew, what she was really afraid of. So she lied, and she avoided the new technology, and she hoped that everything would continue as normal. For 2 weeks, it seemed like everything would be fine. Life in Greendale continued its peaceful rhythm. The shops used their new Smart Pay systems. Customers paid with their cards. Everything worked smoothly. Irene began to relax slightly. Perhaps her fears had been unfounded. Perhaps this change would not affect her life after all. But then, on a gray Monday morning in early May, everything changed. Mrs. Henderson came into the butcher shop, but instead of her usual cheerful greeting, she looked worried and upset. "Oh, Irene," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Something terrible has happened." "What's wrong?" Irene asked, concerned. "My bank account," Mrs. Henderson said. "I checked it this morning and there's money missing. Over 300 pounds, just gone." Tom came out from the back room, wiping his hands on his apron. "What's this about missing money?" Mrs. Henderson explained again. She had checked her bank account online, as she did every Monday morning. 3 payments had been taken out that she did not recognize. Small amounts, 95 pounds, 120 pounds, and 87 pounds. They were listed as merchant payments, but she had not authorized them. "Have you called your bank?" Tom asked. "Yes, I called them right away. They said the payments went through the Smart Pay system, but I don't understand how. I didn't buy anything for those amounts." A cold feeling settled in Irene's stomach. 3 unauthorized payments, all through the Smart Pay system, all in amounts small enough not to trigger immediate suspicion, but large enough to add up to significant money. This was not good. "I'm sure it's just a mistake," Tom said reassuringly. "The bank will sort it out." But Irene was not so sure. Over the next few days, more people came into the shop talking about missing money. Mr. Davies had lost 200 pounds. Young Emma Foster had lost 150. Old Mr. Thompson had lost 60 pounds, nearly a week's pension for him. The pattern was always the same. Multiple small payments, all listed as merchant transactions, all processed through the SmartPay system. And no one could remember making the purchases. By Friday, the whole town was talking about it. The post office was full of worried people comparing notes. The tea room buzzed with anxious conversations. Even the pub was quieter than usual, with people huddled in corners discussing what to do. Tom was furious. "This is that new system," he said angrily. "I knew something like this would happen. These technology companies can't be trusted." Irene listened to all these conversations with growing unease. She recognized the pattern. She had seen this kind of thing before. This was not a technical error. This was not a simple mistake. This was deliberate. This was fraud. This was exactly the kind of thing she had spent her career trying to prevent. And it was happening here in Greendale, to people she knew and cared about. That evening, Irene walked home slowly, deep in thought. She passed Mr. Thompson sitting on the bench outside the post office, looking old and worried. She knew he could not afford to lose 60 pounds. She knew it would affect his ability to buy food and heat his flat. She passed Emma Foster, pushing her baby in the pram, talking anxiously on her mobile phone, probably to her bank. She knew the young family was struggling financially. They did not have money to spare. She passed Mrs. Henderson's house and saw the light on in the living room. She imagined the elderly woman sitting inside, frightened and confused about what had happened to her savings. These people had trusted the new system. They had trusted the technology. And now they were suffering because of that trust. When Irene reached her cottage, she made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. But she did not drink the tea. She just sat there, staring at nothing, thinking. She had run away from technology. She had hidden from her past. She had convinced herself that she wanted nothing to do with that world anymore. But could she really stand by and do nothing while people she cared about were being stolen from? Could she really pretend she did not have the skills to understand what was happening? Could she really keep hiding while vulnerable people lost their money? The answer, she realized with a heavy heart, was no. She could not. She had spent 15 years running away from who she used to be. But perhaps the time had come to stop running. Not because she wanted to, not because she was brave, but because sometimes doing the right thing was more important than protecting yourself. Irene went to bed that night, but she could not sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she should do, thinking about what she could do, thinking about the risks of getting involved, thinking about the costs of staying silent. By dawn, she had made her decision. She was going to investigate the SmartPay system. She was going to find out what was happening. She was going to try to help, even if it meant revealing skills she had hidden for 15 years. She was going to stop being the woman who ran away. She was going to remember, just for a little while, who she used to be. The next morning was Saturday. The butcher shop was closed, so Irene had the day free. She woke early, as always, but this time with a sense of purpose she had not felt in 15 years. She needed information. She needed to understand exactly what was happening with the SmartPay system, and she needed to do it without arousing suspicion or revealing too much about her background. After breakfast, Irene walked into town. Instead of her usual route along the high street, she took a different path that led her past the library. The Greendale Library was small but well-maintained, housed in a Victorian building that had once been the town hall. Irene had been there many times over the years, always borrowing simple novels and occasionally attending the book club. Today, however, she was there for a different reason. She approached the librarian, a pleasant woman named Susan, who had worked there for 20 years. "Good morning, Susan," Irene said with a friendly smile. "Hello, Irene. What can I help you with today?" "I was wondering if I could use one of the computers," Irene said. "I need to look something up online." Susan looked slightly surprised. In 15 years, Irene had never asked to use the library computers. But she recovered quickly and smiled. "Of course. Let me set you up." She led Irene to a row of computers along one wall. "Do you need any help getting started? Some of our older patrons find computers a bit confusing." "I think I'll manage," Irene said gently. "Thank you, Susan." Once Susan had returned to the front desk, Irene sat down at the computer. For a moment, she just looked at the screen. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, not quite touching it. 15 years. 15 years since she had used a computer. 15 years since she had deliberately engaged with technology. Taking a deep breath, Irene placed her fingers on the keyboard. The familiar feeling came back instantly. The muscle memory was still there. Her fingers found the right keys automatically. She opened the web browser and paused again. She needed to be careful. She needed to think like an investigator, not like a frightened woman hiding from her past. First, she needed to understand the SmartPay system itself. She typed SmartPay Merchant Services into the search engine and began reading. SmartPay was a relatively new company founded 3 years ago. They specialized in providing payment processing systems for small towns and local businesses. Their website advertised easy installation, low fees, and excellent customer service. Everything looked legitimate and professional. Irene dug deeper. She found reviews from other towns that had installed SmartPay systems. Most of the reviews were positive. Users praised the ease of use and the reliability of the service. There were a few complaints about customer service response times, but nothing that raised serious concerns. Next, Irene looked for news articles about SmartPay. She found several press releases announcing new contracts with various local councils. Greendale was just one of many towns across the UK that had recently adopted their systems. The company seemed to be growing rapidly. Then Irene searched for SmartPay fraud and SmartPay security issues. This was where things got interesting. She found a few forum posts from users in other towns reporting similar problems to what was happening in Greendale. Unexplained transactions, missing money, small amounts that added up over time. But the posts were scattered across different websites and were mostly dismissed as user error or misunderstandings. Irene sat back and thought carefully. The pattern was clear to her trained eye. This was not random. This was not a technical error. This was a systematic fraud operation that had been carefully designed to avoid detection. The transactions were small enough not to trigger fraud alerts at banks. They were spread out across many different accounts, so no single person lost enough money to make a big fuss. They were disguised as legitimate merchant payments, so they looked like normal transactions. And they were happening in small towns like Greendale, where people were less likely to be technically sophisticated and more likely to trust their local systems. It was elegant, in a horrible way. Someone had designed this fraud operation very carefully. Someone who understood payment processing systems. Someone who knew how to exploit vulnerabilities. someone like the person Irene used to be. She needed more specific information. She needed to see how the SmartPay system actually worked. She needed to examine the transaction data. She needed to understand the security protocols. But she could not do that from a library computer. She would need access to the actual SmartPay equipment in one of the shops. And she would need to do it without anyone knowing what she was really doing. Irene closed the web browser and cleared the computer's history. She sat for a moment, thinking through her plan. She needed to be very careful. She could not let people know she had technical skills. She could not reveal her past. But she also needed to get close enough to the system to understand what was happening. An idea began to form in her mind. She left the library and walked slowly through the town, observing all the shops that had installed the SmartPay systems. She noticed several things. First, all the equipment looked identical. Each shop had the same model of card reader, the same touchscreen display, the same receipt printer. This meant they were probably all running the same software. Second, she noticed that most shop owners had placed the equipment in plain view, right on the counter. They had nothing to hide. They trusted the system completely. This would make it easier for her to observe how it worked. Third, she noticed that the equipment had small LED lights that blinked occasionally. These lights indicated network activity. The devices were constantly communicating with a central server, sending and receiving data. This was normal for this type of system, but it also meant there was a continuous data connection that could potentially be monitored or intercepted. Irene's mind was working now in ways it had not worked for 15 years. She was analyzing, planning, thinking through possibilities. And despite her anxiety, despite her fear, she felt a small spark of something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt competent. She felt capable. She felt like she had a purpose. She spent the rest of the morning walking around Greendale, observing the SmartPay equipment in different shops, noting details, building a mental picture of how the system was set up. By lunchtime, she had formed a plan. It was risky. It required her to do things she had sworn never to do again. But she could not see any other way. That afternoon, Irene did something she had not done in 15 years. She went to the electronics shop in the next town and bought a laptop computer. She paid cash, choosing the simplest, cheapest model available. The young man behind the counter tried to sell her various accessories and upgrades, but she declined politely. "Just the laptop, thank you," she said. Back home, Irene set up the laptop on her kitchen table. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it and turned it on. The familiar glow of the screen felt alien and frightening, but she forced herself to continue. She spent the afternoon reacquainting herself with modern computer systems. Things had changed in 15 years. The interfaces looked different, the software had evolved, but the fundamental principles were the same, and Irene's knowledge, buried but not forgotten, began to resurface. It was like riding a bicycle. Once you learned, you never really forgot. The skills were still there, waiting to be used again. By evening, Irene had set up the laptop with the tools she would need. She had downloaded security analysis software. She had configured network monitoring applications. She had prepared everything she might need to investigate the SmartPay system properly. Then she sat back and looked at what she had done. The laptop sat on her kitchen table, looking completely out of place in her simple, old-fashioned cottage. It represented everything she had been running from, everything she had tried to leave behind. But it also represented the possibility of helping people. The possibility of stopping the fraud that was hurting her community. The possibility of using her skills for good, instead of being haunted by how they had been used for harm. Irene closed the laptop and put it in a drawer, out of sight. Tomorrow was Sunday. The butcher shop would be closed. Tom would be spending the day with his family. She would have an opportunity to visit the shop alone and examine the SmartPay equipment without anyone asking questions. She just needed a plausible reason to be there, and she knew exactly what that reason would be. On Sunday morning, Irene dressed in her usual clothes and walked to the butcher shop. She carried a small shopping bag containing cleaning supplies. If anyone saw her, she would say she had come in to do some extra cleaning. Tom would not mind. She often did little extra tasks on her days off. The street was quiet. Most people were at home or at church. Irene unlocked the side door of the shop with her key and slipped inside quickly. The shop was dim and silent. Irene turned on just one light, enough to see by, but not enough to attract attention from outside. She put her cleaning supplies on the counter and looked at the SmartPay equipment. The touchscreen display glowed softly in the dim light. The card reader sat next to it, sleek and modern. A small printer for receipts completed the setup. Everything looked innocent and professional. Irene took a deep breath. This was it, the moment when she stopped running and started fighting back. The moment when she chose to be who she really was, instead of who she had been pretending to be. She pulled out the laptop from her bag and set it on the counter next to the SmartPay equipment. She turned it on and waited for it to boot up. Her heart was beating fast. Her hands felt cold. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Not now. When the laptop was ready, Irene opened the network analysis software. She began scanning for the wireless signals that the SmartPay equipment was using to communicate. Within seconds, she identified the network. The equipment was sending data to a remote server using standard encrypted protocols. Irene worked carefully, methodically, using skills she had not used in 15 years, but which came back to her like a familiar language. She analyzed the data packets. She examined the encryption methods. She looked for vulnerabilities. What she found both horrified her and confirmed her suspicions. The SmartPay system had been professionally designed, but it had deliberate weaknesses built into it. The encryption was adequate but not strong. The authentication protocols had loopholes. The transaction logging had gaps. These were not accidents. These were deliberate design decisions. Someone had built these vulnerabilities into the system on purpose. Someone who understood security well enough to know exactly how to create weaknesses that would not be obvious to casual inspection, but could be exploited by someone with the right knowledge. Irene continued her investigation. She accessed the transaction logs stored locally on the device. With some careful work, she was able to decrypt the recent transaction history. And there it was. Clear evidence of the fraud. The transaction logs showed 2 sets of payments. The first set was legitimate. Payments made by customers for goods purchased at the butcher shop. These matched what Tom would have recorded in his books. But the second set was different. These were small, unauthorized transactions that were being processed through the system without any connection to actual purchases. They appeared in the logs as legitimate merchant payments, but they were being taken from customer accounts without permission. The unauthorized transactions were cleverly disguised. They used merchant codes that made them look like small purchases from local shops. They were timed to occur shortly after legitimate transactions, so they would blend in with normal payment activity. They were never large enough to trigger fraud alerts, but they were systematic, regular, ongoing. And they were happening across all the SmartPay equipment in Greendale, not just in the butcher shop. Irene sat back, feeling sick. She had been right. This was professional fraud, carefully planned and executed, and it was hurting innocent people in her community. She continued working, tracing the flow of money. The unauthorized transactions were being routed through a series of merchant accounts. The money was being aggregated, laundered through apparently legitimate businesses, and then transferred to offshore accounts. The trail was complex and deliberately obscured. But Irene had spent years designing security for financial systems. She knew how these things worked. She knew how to follow the money. She just needed time and patience. She spent 3 hours in the butcher shop that Sunday morning, working carefully, documenting everything she found. She took screenshots, she copied data files, she traced network connections. She built a complete picture of how the fraud was operating. Finally, when she had gathered all the information she could safely collect, Irene packed up her laptop and cleaned up any evidence of her presence. She made sure everything in the shop looked exactly as it had when she arrived. She locked up carefully and walked home. Back in her cottage, Irene sat at her kitchen table with the laptop open in front of her. She looked at all the evidence she had collected. She had proof of the fraud. She had documentation of how it worked. She had traces showing where the money was going. But now she faced a difficult question. What should she do with this information? She could not go to the police directly. They would ask how she had obtained the information. They would want to know why a butcher's assistant knew how to conduct sophisticated technical investigations. They would start asking questions about her past. She could try to report it anonymously. But would anonymous reports be taken seriously? And could she provide enough evidence without revealing her involvement? Irene sat for a long time, thinking through her options. The sun moved across the sky outside her window. The afternoon passed. Evening approached. And still she sat, weighing the risks, considering the possibilities, trying to find a way to help without exposing herself. Finally, as the sun began to set, Irene came to a decision. She would take one more step. She would gather more evidence. She would trace the money to its final destination. She would build a case so clear and compelling that the authorities would have to act, even on an anonymous report. It was a risk. It would require more time, more work, more exposure to the technology she had been avoiding for 15 years. But the people of Greendale deserved justice. They deserved to get their money back. They deserved to feel safe in their own community. And Irene, for all her fears and all her running, could not stand by and do nothing. So she opened her laptop, took a deep breath, and continued her investigation. Over the next week, Irene lived a double life that would have seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. During the day, she was the friendly, reliable assistant at the butcher shop, serving customers and helping Tom. But in the evenings, alone in her cottage, she became someone else. She became the skilled security analyst she had once been, following the trail of fraud through the digital networks. It was exhausting. More than that, it was emotionally draining. Every evening when she opened her laptop, Irene felt like she was stepping back into a nightmare she had spent 15 years trying to escape. The technical work itself was familiar and even satisfying, but it brought back memories she had tried to forget. Memories of the scandal that had destroyed her life. Memories of sitting in police interview rooms, trying to explain complex technical details to people who did not understand. Memories of seeing her name in newspapers, always accompanied by words like fraud and scandal and betrayal. But she pushed through the fear and the painful memories. She had to. Too many people were being hurt. Each evening, Irene would make herself a simple dinner, then sit at her kitchen table with the laptop. She had configured her network connection to be as secure and anonymous as possible. She was not doing anything illegal. She was investigating a crime. But she was cautious nonetheless. She could not afford to leave traces that might lead back to her. The trail of money was complex, but Irene had the skills to follow it. Each unauthorized transaction from Greendale was routed through a merchant processing account. From there, the money was aggregated and transferred to what appeared to be a legitimate business account. But when Irene dug deeper, she discovered that this business was just a shell company, a legal entity that existed only on paper, with no actual operations. From the shell company, the money was moved again, this time to an account in the Isle of Man. From there, it was split into smaller amounts and distributed to multiple accounts in different jurisdictions: the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Singapore. Each transfer was structured to stay below the thresholds that would trigger automatic reporting requirements. It was sophisticated money laundering, designed by someone who understood international banking regulations and financial crime detection systems. This was not the work of petty criminals. This was professional fraud, probably organized by people with experience in the financial industry. As Irene traced the money flow, she began to see the full scale of the operation. Greendale was not the only target. The same fraud pattern was being executed in dozens of small towns across the UK. Wherever SmartPay had installed their systems, money was being stolen from local residents. Small amounts from each person, but when aggregated across thousands of victims in dozens of towns, it added up to millions of pounds. The more Irene discovered, the angrier she became. This was exactly the kind of crime she had dedicated her career to preventing. These criminals were exploiting the trust of ordinary people in small communities. They were stealing from people who could least afford it: pensioners like Mr. Thompson, young families like the Fosters, elderly widows like Mrs. Henderson. By the end of the week, Irene had traced the money to its ultimate destination. The final accounts were held in the Cayman Islands under the names of 3 offshore companies. These companies were registered to a business address that was actually just a post office box. But through careful research, Irene found connections between these offshore companies and several individuals in the UK. One name kept appearing in the records: Marcus Bellamy. He was listed as a director of one of the offshore companies. A quick online search revealed that Marcus Bellamy was a financial technology consultant based in London. His professional profile described him as an expert in payment processing systems and digital banking platforms. Irene felt her stomach tighten. She knew this type of person. She had worked with people like this throughout her career. Intelligent, well-educated professionals who understood the systems deeply enough to exploit them. People who used their knowledge not to protect others, but to steal from them. She dug deeper into Marcus Bellamy's background. He had worked for several major technology companies before becoming an independent consultant 5 years ago. He was well connected in the industry. He had published articles about payment security and had spoken at conferences. And, Irene discovered, he had been one of the founding investors in SmartPay. He was not officially listed as an employee or director of the company, but he was clearly involved at a deep level. The pieces were coming together. SmartPay itself might have been a legitimate company initially, but someone, probably Marcus Bellamy and his associates, had built fraud capabilities into the system from the beginning. They had created the vulnerabilities. They had designed the money laundering mechanisms. They had identified targets like Greendale, where victims would be vulnerable and unlikely to have the technical knowledge to understand what was happening. By the weekend, Irene had compiled a comprehensive dossier of evidence. She had documented the fraud mechanisms. She had traced the money flows. She had identified the key individuals involved. She had everything the authorities would need to investigate and prosecute the criminals. But she still faced the problem of how to report this information without revealing her identity. If she went to the police directly, they would ask too many questions. Her technical skills would become obvious. Her past might be uncovered. And she was not sure she could handle that exposure. On Saturday evening, Irene sat in her cottage, looking at all the evidence on her laptop screen. She had done everything she could do alone. Now she needed help. She needed someone with authority who could act on this information, someone who would take it seriously, someone who could be trusted. An idea began to form. The Greendale police station was run by Sergeant Graham Willis, a man in his late 50s who had served in the town for 20 years. Irene knew him slightly. He sometimes bought meat from the butcher shop. He seemed like a decent, honest man. More importantly, he was not some young technician who might question too deeply where this information came from. He was a traditional policeman who understood crime and evidence, even if he did not understand technology very well. If Irene could get the evidence to Sergeant Willis in a way that was convincing but did not reveal her identity, perhaps he would take it to the proper authorities. Perhaps he would start an investigation. Perhaps he would help the victims of Greendale get their money back. It was the best option she could think of. Not perfect, but workable. Irene spent Sunday creating a detailed report. She wrote it in plain English, explaining the fraud in terms that a non-technical person could understand. She included clear documentation of the evidence. She provided the names of the key suspects. She explained how the money had been stolen and where it had gone. She made it as complete and professional as possible. But she did not sign it. She did not provide any contact information. She made it anonymous. On Monday morning, Irene printed the report at the library using one of the public computers. She put it in a plain envelope. Then, during her lunch break from the butcher shop, she walked to the police station and dropped the envelope through the letterbox when no one was looking. Her heart pounded as she walked away. She had done it. She had reported the crime. Now it was up to others to act. Back at the butcher shop, Irene tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept wandering to the police station, wondering if Sergeant Willis had found the envelope yet, wondering if he would take it seriously, wondering what would happen next. She did not have to wonder long. That afternoon, while Irene was helping an elderly customer choose a roasting joint, she saw Sergeant Willis walk past the shop window. He was talking on his mobile phone, looking serious and intent. He seemed to be heading toward the town hall. 2 hours later, Tom came back from his afternoon break with news. "Have you heard? The police are investigating the SmartPay fraud. Apparently, someone provided them with detailed evidence. They're taking it very seriously. Sergeant Willis has been on the phone to the regional fraud squad all afternoon." Irene felt a wave of relief wash over her. It had worked. Her report had been taken seriously. The investigation had begun. "That's wonderful news," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and natural. "Perhaps people will get their money back." I hope so, Tom said. Poor old Mr. Thompson has been so worried, and Mrs. Henderson. It's been terrible seeing them so upset. Over the next few days, activity in Greendale increased dramatically. More police officers arrived from the regional headquarters. They interviewed the victims of the fraud. They examined the SmartPay equipment. They contacted the company for information about their systems and their personnel. Irene watched all this from a safe distance, serving customers in the butcher shop, listening to the conversations in the tea room, observing the investigation unfold. She felt satisfaction at seeing action being taken, but she also felt anxiety. What if the investigation led to questions about the anonymous report? What if someone traced it back to her? What if her involvement was discovered? She tried to stay calm and continue her normal routine. Just be the butcher's assistant. Just be quiet, Irene Walsh. Just be invisible. But on Thursday afternoon, something happened that made her realize she might not be able to stay invisible much longer. Mrs. Henderson came into the shop, looking happier than Irene had seen her in weeks. "Oh, Irene!" she exclaimed. "Have you heard the news? The police have arrested someone. They've found the people who stole our money." "That's wonderful," Irene said warmly. "I'm so glad." "And they say we'll get our money back. Within a few weeks, they think. Isn't that marvelous?" "It really is," Irene agreed. "How did they catch them so quickly?" "Well, that's the interesting part," Mrs. Henderson said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Apparently, someone gave the police detailed information about the fraud. Someone who really understood how it all worked, an expert of some kind. But no one knows who it was. They're calling them the guardian angel of Greendale." Irene felt her face flush slightly. "That's quite dramatic." "Well, it's true, isn't it? Someone out there was looking out for us. Someone who understood these technical things. Someone who cared enough to investigate and help. I wish we knew who it was so we could thank them properly." As Mrs. Henderson continued talking, Irene felt an uncomfortable mixture of pride and fear. Pride that her work had helped her community. Fear that her skills had been noticed, that questions might be asked, that her peaceful anonymity might be threatened. That evening, as Irene walked home from work, she noticed more people than usual on the streets. Small groups were gathered, talking animatedly. The mood in Greendale had changed. The anxiety and fear of the past weeks had been replaced by relief and excitement. The threat had been identified. The criminals had been caught. The money would be returned. Everything would be all right. Irene should have felt satisfied. She should have felt proud. She had helped make this happen. Her skills, her knowledge, her careful investigation, these had led to justice. But instead, she felt worried. Because she knew that her work was not quite done, and she knew that the final step might be the most difficult of all. Despite the arrests and the police investigation, not everything went smoothly. On Friday morning, Irene woke to find Greendale in a state of panic. The SmartPay system had stopped working. Every shop in town was unable to process card payments. The equipment was non-responsive. Nothing worked. Only cash transactions were possible, and in modern England, many people did not carry much cash. Tom was frustrated when Irene arrived at the butcher shop. "This is ridiculous," he said. "How are we supposed to run a business if people can't pay?" The technical support number for SmartPay was overwhelmed. Shop owners who called were put on hold for hours. No technicians were being sent out. No one could explain what had happened or when the systems would be fixed. By midday, the situation was becoming serious. Shops were losing business. Customers who only had cards were unable to make purchases. Some people drove to the next town to use cash machines, but those queues were very long. Irene listened to the complaints and concerns with growing worry. She understood what had probably happened. When the police had begun investigating SmartPay and had arrested Marcus Bellamy and his associates, someone must have triggered a shutdown of the systems. Either the company was protecting itself from further evidence collection, or the criminals had built in a kill switch that would destroy evidence if they were caught. Either way, the result was the same. The people of Greendale were suffering again. Not from theft this time, but from the chaos created when the fraudulent system was exposed. By Saturday morning, the situation was worse. More details had emerged in the news. SmartPay was under investigation not just in Greendale, but across the UK. The company's offices had been raided. Senior executives had been arrested. The entire company was in chaos, and in dozens of small towns, payment systems were down. Thousands of small businesses were unable to operate properly. Economic activity was grinding to a halt. In Greendale, Tom had resorted to putting a sign in the window. Cash only. Sorry for inconvenience. But many regular customers simply went to other towns where payment systems still worked. Business was down significantly. The town council called an emergency meeting on Saturday afternoon in the town hall. Irene did not usually attend council meetings, but she decided to go to this one, curious about what solutions might be proposed. The town hall was packed. Nearly everyone in Greendale had shown up, anxious to hear what could be done. Sergeant Willis was there, along with 2 officials from the regional fraud squad. The mayor, a well-meaning man named Robert Thompson, tried to call the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming," Mayor Thompson said. "I know we're all concerned about the current situation. Sergeant Willis and these officers from the fraud squad are here to update us on the investigation and the technical problems we're experiencing." Sergeant Willis stood up and addressed the crowd. "First, the good news. We have made several arrests in connection with the fraud. The main suspects are in custody. We believe we have identified most of the people involved in the scheme." There was a murmur of approval from the crowd. "Now, the bad news," Sergeant Willis continued. "The SmartPay systems have been shut down as part of the investigation. This is affecting many towns, not just Greendale. Unfortunately, it may be several weeks before new payment systems can be installed. In the meantime, businesses will need to operate on a cash-only basis or use their old equipment if they still have it." "But we got rid of our old equipment," one shop owner called out. "We were told we had to switch to SmartPay." "I understand that," Sergeant Willis said. "We're working with the council and with the banking associations to find solutions as quickly as possible." "What about our stolen money?" Mrs. Henderson asked from the back of the room. "When will we get that back?" "We're working on that too," one of the fraud squad officers said. "We've frozen the accounts where the money was sent, but recovering and distributing the funds will take time. It could be several months." The crowd was not happy. People started calling out questions and complaints. The meeting was becoming chaotic. Mayor Thompson tried to restore order. "Please, everyone, I know this is frustrating, but we need to work together and be patient." "Patient?" Mr. Davies stood up angrily. "Some of us can't afford to be patient. Old Mr. Thompson lost nearly a week's pension. Mrs. Foster and her husband are struggling to buy food for their baby. We need solutions now, not in several months." The crowd erupted in agreement. The mayor looked helpless. The police officers looked uncomfortable. No one seemed to have answers that would satisfy the angry, worried people of Greendale. Irene sat in the back of the hall, listening to all of this with a heavy heart. She had helped expose the fraud. She had provided evidence that led to arrests. But in doing so, she had also created a new crisis for her community. The payment systems were down. People's money was still missing. Businesses were suffering. The problems had multiplied instead of being solved. And she was the only person in the room who had the technical knowledge to potentially fix some of these problems. But revealing that knowledge would mean revealing who she was. It would mean exposing her past. It would mean the end of her quiet, anonymous life in Greendale. The meeting continued for another hour, but no real solutions emerged. People left the town hall angry and frustrated. Irene walked home slowly, deep in thought. That evening, as she sat in her cottage, Irene thought carefully about her options. She could do nothing. She could let the authorities handle things in their own time. She could protect her anonymity and her peaceful life. But that meant watching her community suffer. It meant watching Mr. Thompson struggle without his pension money. It meant watching small businesses fail because they could not process payments. It meant standing by while people she cared about were hurt, or she could help. Really help. Not anonymously this time, but openly. She could offer her technical skills. She could work with the authorities to resolve the problems more quickly. She could use her knowledge to benefit her community. But that would mean revealing who she was. It would mean answering difficult questions about her past. It would mean the end of Irene Walsh, the simple butcher's assistant. It would mean becoming, again, at least partly, the person she used to be. Irene looked around her small cottage, at the simple furniture, the bare walls, the life she had built through 15 years of hiding and running. Was she ready to give this up? Was she ready to face her past? She thought about Mrs. Henderson, crying over her stolen savings. She thought about Mr. Thompson, worried about how he would pay his bills. She thought about Emma Foster, struggling to care for her baby. She thought about Tom, watching his business suffer through no fault of his own. These people had accepted her. They had been kind to her. They had made her feel welcome in Greendale. They had given her a community when she had nothing. And now they needed help. They needed someone with technical skills. They needed someone who understood financial systems and security. They needed someone exactly like the person Irene used to be. The decision, when it came, was both difficult and inevitable. Irene realized that she could not hide anymore. She could not keep running from who she was. Sometimes being brave meant facing your fears. Sometimes being good meant risking your own safety to help others. And sometimes the past could not be outrun. It could only be faced, accepted, and used for good. Irene made up her mind. On Monday morning, she would go to Sergeant Willis. She would reveal her technical skills. She would offer to help. She would face whatever consequences came from that decision. It was time to stop being the woman who ran away. It was time to be the woman who stood up. Not because she was brave, not because she was confident, but because it was the right thing to do. That night, Irene slept poorly. Her mind raced with worries and fears. What would people think? What questions would be asked? How would her life change? But beneath the fear, there was something else, something she had not felt in 15 years. There was a small sense of purpose, a small sense of rightness, a small sense that maybe, just maybe, she was finally doing what she should have done all along. She was not running anymore. She was not hiding anymore. She was stepping forward into uncertainty. And that, she realized, took more courage than running ever had. Monday morning dawned gray and drizzly. Irene woke early, as always, but this time she lay in bed for a few minutes, gathering her courage. Today her life would change. Today she would stop hiding. Today she would face her past. She got dressed in her usual clothes, comfortable trousers, plain blouse, warm cardigan. But this time, she also packed a bag with her laptop and all the evidence she had gathered. She would need it when she spoke to Sergeant Willis. At 7 o'clock, instead of going to the butcher shop, Irene walked to the police station. It was a small building on Church Street, traditional and unimposing. She had walked past it hundreds of times in 15 years, but had never gone inside. The front desk was staffed by a young officer Irene did not recognize. He looked up as she entered. "Can I help you?" he asked politely. "I'd like to speak with Sergeant Willis, please," Irene said. Her voice was calmer than she felt. "It's about the smart pay investigation." "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I think he'll want to see me. Please tell him that I have information about how the fraud was discovered. Tell him I'm the one who sent the anonymous report." The young officer's eyes widened slightly. He picked up the phone and spoke quietly into it. A few minutes later, Sergeant Willis appeared, looking curious and surprised. "Mrs. Walsh?" he said. "Please, come through." He led her to a small office at the back of the station. It was cluttered with papers and filing cabinets, but it felt more comfortable than threatening. Sergeant Willis gestured to a chair. "Please, sit down. Can I get you some tea?" "No, thank you," Irene said, sitting down carefully. She placed her bag on her lap, holding it like a shield. Sergeant Willis sat behind his desk and looked at her with interest. "Now, what's this about you sending the anonymous report? I have to say, you're not what I expected." Irene took a deep breath. "I know. I'm just the butcher's assistant. Quiet Irene Walsh, who came to Greendale 15 years ago and has lived here peacefully ever since." She paused. "But that's not all I am. That's not all I've been." And then, for the first time in 15 years, Irene began to tell the truth about her past. She told Sergeant Willis about her career in London, about her work as a senior software security architect at Sentinel Financial Solutions, about the project she had led, about the fraud scandal that had destroyed everything. She explained how she had been innocent, but how her reputation had been ruined anyway. How she had lost her job, her friends, her entire life. How she had fallen into depression and had needed to escape. "I came to Greendale to hide," she said quietly. "I wanted to get away from technology, from finance, from everything that had hurt me. I wanted to be someone simple, someone safe, someone no one would look at twice." Sergeant Willis listened without interruption. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a moment, thinking. "So when the smart pay fraud started here in Greendale," he said slowly, "you recognized the pattern." "Yes," Irene confirmed. "I saw immediately that it was not a technical error. It was deliberate fraud, professionally designed. I couldn't stand by and watch people in my community be stolen from. So I investigated. I used my old skills to trace the money and identify the criminals. And then I sent you the report, hoping you would act on it without asking where it came from." "And we did," Sergeant Willis said. Your report was extraordinarily detailed. We've been able to make arrests and freeze assets based on your evidence. You've helped a lot of people, Mrs. Walsh. But now the payment systems are down, Irene said, and people are still suffering. Their money hasn't been returned yet. Businesses are struggling. I've caused a new set of problems by exposing the fraud. Sergeant Willis shook his head. You didn't cause these problems. The criminals caused them. You just brought them to light. Perhaps, Irene said. But I might be able to help fix some of the immediate problems. That's why I'm here. I think I can help restore payment processing to Greendale more quickly than waiting for new systems to be installed. But I would need access to the SmartPay equipment. I would need cooperation from the authorities. And it would mean revealing my technical skills publicly. Sergeant Willis leaned back in his chair, considering. You're asking me to let a civilian access evidence in a criminal investigation. I suppose I am, Irene admitted. I know it's irregular, but I also know these systems better than anyone else you're likely to find. I can remove the fraudulent components and restore basic functionality. I can help people get back to normal while permanent solutions are found. Why are you willing to do this now? Sergeant Willis asked. You've protected your anonymity for 15 years. You sent the original report anonymously. Why reveal yourself now? Irene was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Because anonymity isn't enough anymore, she said finally. I can't help from the shadows. If I really want to make things better, I need to step forward and do it properly, even if it means people knowing the truth about me. Sergeant Willis studied her face. You understand that I'll need to verify your background. I'll need to check that you are who you say you are and that you have the qualifications you claim. Of course, Irene said. I expected that. And you understand that revealing your technical skills will change how people in Greendale see you. Your quiet life here will be different. I know, Irene said softly. But hiding wasn't working anymore anyway. I was only half alive, pretending to be someone I wasn't. Maybe it's time to be whole again, even if it's frightening. Sergeant Willis nodded slowly. All right, I'll need to make some phone calls. I'll need to contact the fraud squad and get authorization. It might take a day or two, but if everything checks out and if the senior investigators approve, I think we can work something out. Thank you, Irene said, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. In the meantime, Sergeant Willis said, I need you to leave all your evidence with me, the laptop, the files, everything. It will all need to be properly logged and reviewed. Irene handed over her bag. With it went the last physical evidence of her secret investigation, the last tangible connection to the hidden work she had done. She felt oddly light without it. As she stood to leave, Sergeant Willis said, Mrs. Walsh, what you did, investigating the fraud, collecting evidence, coming forward now, it takes real courage. Whatever happened in your past, you should know that you've done something good here. Irene felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. It had been a very long time since anyone had told her she had done something good. Thank you, Sergeant Willis. That means more than you know. She left the police station and walked slowly toward the butcher shop. She was late for work now, which had never happened before in 15 years. Tom would be wondering where she was. When she arrived, Tom was serving a customer. He looked up in surprise when she entered. Irene, is everything all right? You're never late. I'm sorry, Tom, Irene said. Something came up this morning. Could we talk after you finished with your customer? Tom looked concerned but nodded. Once the customer had left, he turned to Irene with worried eyes. "Is everything all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," Irene assured him. "But I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." And then, for the second time that morning, Irene told the truth about her past. She told Tom about her career in London, about the scandal, about why she had come to Greendale, about the anonymous investigation she had conducted into the SmartPay fraud. Tom listened in stunned silence. When she finished, he sat down heavily on the stool behind the counter. "I can't believe it," he said. "All these years and I never knew. You're some kind of computer genius?" "I was a security architect," Irene corrected gently. "I'm not sure I'd call myself a genius. But yes, I have technical skills that I've kept hidden." "Why didn't you tell me?" Tom asked. "Did you not trust me?" "It wasn't about trust," Irene said. "It was about running away. I wanted to be someone different, someone simple. I wanted to forget who I used to be." Tom was quiet for a moment, processing everything. Then he said, "So you're the one who exposed the fraud? You're the guardian angel everyone's been talking about." "I suppose so," Irene said, "though I don't feel very angelic. I feel like I've caused as many problems as I've solved." Tom shook his head firmly. "Don't say that. You helped people. You helped Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Henderson and all of us. You did something brave." "Maybe," Irene said, "but now things are going to change. People will know. My quiet life here will be different." Tom stood up and put a hand on her shoulder. "Irene, you've been a good friend and a good employee for 15 years. Whatever else you are or were, that hasn't changed. You'll always have a place here, if you want it." Irene felt those tears threatening again. "Thank you, Tom. That means everything to me." The rest of the day was difficult. Irene tried to focus on work, but her mind kept wandering. She wondered what the police were discovering as they verified her story. She wondered how long it would take to get authorization for her to help with the payment systems. She wondered how people in Greendale would react when they learned the truth. That evening, as she walked home, Irene felt exhausted. It had been the most emotionally draining day she had experienced in years. But beneath the exhaustion, there was also a strange sense of lightness. She had told the truth. She had stopped hiding. Whatever happened now, at least she was being honest. The next 2 days passed slowly. Irene worked at the butcher shop, waiting to hear from Sergeant Willis. She tried to act normal, but Tom could see she was anxious. He was kind and patient, not pushing her to talk, just being supportive. On Wednesday afternoon, Sergeant Willis came into the butcher shop. He nodded at Irene. "Could you come to the station after work? We've had the authorization approved. We'd like to discuss the plan for restoring the payment systems." Irene's heart beat faster. "Of course. I'll be there at 6. At 6 o'clock, Irene arrived at the police station. This time, she was led to a larger conference room where several people were waiting. Sergeant Willis was there, along with the 2 fraud squad officers she had seen at the town meeting, and a man in a business suit who introduced himself as Gerald Cooper from the Banking Association. "Mrs. Walsh," Gerald Cooper said, shaking her hand. "Or should I say, Ms. Walsh. We've been reviewing your credentials. Your background is quite impressive." "Thank you," Irene said cautiously. "We've also been reviewing the evidence you collected on the SmartPay fraud," one of the fraud squad officers added. "It's excellent work. Very thorough. You've made our investigation much easier." I'm glad I could help, Irene said. Gerald Cooper got down to business. Now, we understand you believe you can restore basic payment functionality to Greendale while we arrange permanent replacements for the smart pay systems? I believe so, yes, Irene confirmed. The smart pay systems have fraudulent components built into them, but the underlying hardware and core software are standard commercial products. If I can access the systems, I can remove the malicious code and restore legitimate payment processing. How long would that take? Sergeant Willis asked. It depends on how much access I'm given and whether there are any complications, Irene said. But I estimate I could restore one shop's system in a few hours. If I work systematically through all the shops in Greendale, perhaps 3 or 4 days to restore everyone. That's much faster than waiting for new installations, Gerald Cooper said, sounding pleased. Those could take weeks. There are risks, though, Irene cautioned. The systems were compromised. Even after I remove the malicious code, there might be security vulnerabilities I haven't identified. The systems would be functional, but they might not be as secure as purpose-built, professionally vetted equipment. But they'd be more secure than they are now, with the fraud component still active? One of the fraud squad officers asked. Yes, definitely, Irene confirmed. And more secure than operating without card payment systems at all, which is the current situation. They discussed the details for another hour. A plan was formed. Irene would be given supervised access to the smart pay equipment in each shop. She would work under police oversight, with everything she did documented and reviewed. The Banking Association would provide temporary liability coverage, and the whole process would be treated as part of the criminal investigation, which gave them legal authority to modify the systems. There's one more thing, Sergeant Willis said as the meeting was wrapping up. The mayor wants to hold a public meeting tomorrow evening to explain the plan to the town. You'll need to be there, Mrs. Walsh. People will want to know who you are and why you're qualified to do this work. Irene felt her stomach clench. A public meeting. Facing the whole town. Revealing herself to everyone. This was the moment she had been dreading. I understand, she said quietly. I'll be there. That night, Irene barely slept. Tomorrow evening, her 15-year secret would become public knowledge. The quiet butcher's assistant would be revealed as a former technology executive. The simple, unremarkable Irene Walsh would be shown to be someone quite different. How would people react? Would they be angry that she had lied about her background? Would they be impressed by her skills? Would they still trust her? Would they still accept her as part of their community? There was no way to know. All she could do was face the meeting with honesty and hope that the people of Greendale would understand why she had hidden her past. Thursday evening arrived too quickly. The town hall was packed again, even more crowded than the previous meeting. Word had spread that there would be important news about the payment systems. Everyone in Greendale was there. Irene sat in a chair on the small stage at the front of the hall. She felt exposed and vulnerable. Hundreds of eyes could see her. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just part of the crowd. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming. I know everyone is anxious to hear about solutions to our payment problems. I have good news tonight. He explained that the police investigation had been successful. The criminals behind the smart pay fraud had been identified and arrested. Efforts were underway to recover the stolen money and return it to victims. New permanent payment systems would be installed in the coming weeks. But we also have a more immediate solution, Mayor Thompson continued. We have someone in our community who has the technical skills to restore the current systems to working order much more quickly. Someone who has already helped us by exposing the fraud in the first place." He gestured toward Irene. "Many of you know Irene Walsh. She's worked at Jenkins' butcher shop for 15 years. She's been a kind and helpful member of our community." Irene could see people nodding. They all knew her. Quiet, friendly Irene, who served them meat and chatted about the weather. "What you might not know," Mayor Thompson continued, "is that before coming to Greendale, Irene had a distinguished career in London as a senior security architect for financial technology systems. She designed the security for payment processing systems used by major banks across Europe." A murmur of surprise ran through the crowd. People turned to look at Irene with new interest. The quiet butcher's assistant? An expert in financial technology? It did not fit with what they knew of her. "Irene is the person who investigated the SmartPay fraud," Mayor Thompson explained. "She collected the evidence that led to the arrests. She traced the stolen money. She provided the police with detailed information about how the crime was carried out. And now, she has offered to use her skills to restore our payment systems so that local businesses can operate normally again." The surprise in the hall was giving way to confused curiosity. People were whispering to each other, trying to make sense of this revelation. "I've asked Irene to explain her background to you all," Mayor Thompson said, "so you understand who she is and why she can help us." "Irene?" Irene stood up on shaky legs. She walked to the front of the stage and looked out at the sea of familiar faces. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Thompson, Emma Foster with her baby, Tom Jenkins standing near the back. All the people she had known for 15 years. All the people she had hidden the truth from. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "Good evening, everyone. As Mayor Thompson said, my name is Irene Walsh. That much, at least, is true. But there are things about me that you don't know. Things I haven't told anyone. Things I've been hiding from for a very long time." The hall was completely silent. Everyone was listening intently. 15 years ago, I lived in London. I worked for a company called Sentinel Financial Solutions. I was responsible for designing security systems for payment processing platforms. I was very good at my job. I loved my work. I thought I was making the world safer. Irene paused, gathering courage for the harder part. But then something terrible happened. People at my company, people I trusted, used my work to commit fraud. They modified the systems I had built. They stole money from thousands of people. When the scandal was discovered, I was investigated. I was questioned. My name was in all the newspapers connected to the fraud. She saw people's expressions changing. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked confused. "I was never charged with any crime," Irene continued. "I was innocent, but my reputation was destroyed anyway. I lost my job. I lost my friends. I lost everything I had worked for. And I fell into a very dark place." Her voice became quieter, more emotional. "I thought about ending my life, but instead, I chose to end the person I had been. I sold everything. I took what little money I had left, and I came here, to Greendale. I wanted to hide. I wanted to be someone different, someone simple, someone who would never be hurt by technology again." Irene looked around the hall, making eye contact with people she knew. "I told you I was a retired school teacher. That was a lie. I'm sorry for that. I've spent 15 years lying about who I am because I was afraid. Afraid of being hurt again. Afraid of being judged. Afraid of being rejected. She could see Mrs. Henderson dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Tom was watching her with a sad but understanding expression. When the SmartPay fraud started here in Greendale, I recognized it immediately. I knew it was not a technical error. I knew people were being stolen from, and I couldn't stand by and do nothing. So I investigated. I used the skills I had tried so hard to forget. I traced the money. I identified the criminals. And I sent the evidence to the police. Irene's voice grew stronger. I did it anonymously because I was still afraid, still hiding. But then the systems went down and everyone continued to suffer, and I realized that hiding wasn't enough anymore. If I really wanted to help, I needed to step forward. I needed to stop running from who I am. She spread her hands in a gesture of openness. So here I am, not the person you thought I was. Not the quiet, simple butcher's assistant. But someone with a complicated past and specialist knowledge. Someone who made mistakes. Someone who ran away. But also someone who cares about this community and wants to help. Irene finished speaking and stood there, vulnerable and exposed, waiting for the reaction. For a moment, the hall was completely silent. Then, from the back of the room, Tom Jenkins started clapping. The sound was startling in the quiet hall. Others joined in. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Davies. More and more people began to applaud. Not everyone. Some people still looked confused or skeptical. But many were clapping, showing their support. Irene felt tears streaming down her face. She had expected rejection. She had expected judgment. But instead, many people were offering acceptance, understanding, appreciation for her honesty. Mayor Thompson stepped forward. Thank you, Irene, for sharing your story with us. I think we can all understand why you kept your past private, and we can all appreciate that you've stepped forward now to help our community. He turned to address the crowd. The plan is for Irene to work with the police to restore functionality to our payment systems. This will take a few days. Each shop will have their system modified to remove the fraudulent components. Everything will be supervised and documented. And then, while we wait for permanent new systems to be installed, we'll at least be able to operate normally. How do we know we can trust her? Someone called out from the crowd. Irene couldn't see who it was. Sergeant Willis stood up to answer. We've thoroughly verified Mrs. Walsh's background and qualifications. Everything she told us checks out. Her previous employers confirm she was an excellent professional who was caught up in someone else's crime. The police and the banking association are confident in her abilities. She's lived here for 15 years and never caused any problems, Tom Jenkins added from the back. She's been nothing but helpful and kind to everyone. I don't see why we should doubt her now just because we've learned she has skills we didn't know about. There were murmurs of agreement from various parts of the hall. Could she have been part of the SmartPay fraud herself? Another voice asked. Maybe she came here to target us? Irene winced at the suggestion, but Sergeant Willis answered firmly. Absolutely not. We've investigated that possibility thoroughly. Mrs. Walsh had no connection to SmartPay or to any of the people involved in the fraud. In fact, by exposing the fraud, she prevented it from continuing. She's saved this community from losing much more money than was actually stolen. Mayor Thompson called for a vote. Those in favor of accepting Irene's help to restore our payment systems, please raise your hands. Most hands went up. Not all, but most. It was enough. "Then it's decided," Mayor Thompson said. "Work will begin tomorrow morning. Irene will start with the shops on the high street and work through the town systematically. We hope to have all systems restored within a week." As the meeting broke up, people approached Irene with mixed reactions. Some thanked her for her honesty and for her help. Others were more reserved, still processing the revelation. A few avoided her altogether. Mrs. Henderson was one of the first to approach. She took Irene's hands in hers. "My dear, what a difficult time you must have had. I'm so glad you trusted us enough to tell the truth. And I'm grateful for what you're doing to help us." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Irene said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means so much to me." Young Emma Foster came up next, bouncing her baby gently. "I had no idea you had such an interesting background, and you've been so modest all these years. Thank you for investigating the fraud. That stolen money was really hurting us." Mr. Thompson shuffled over, leaning on his walking stick. "I've always thought you were a good woman, Irene. Nothing I heard tonight changes that opinion." Tom Jenkins was waiting until the crowd thinned out. When he finally reached Irene, he gave her an awkward hug. "You did good tonight, Irene. You were brave. I'm proud to know you." Irene hugged him back, unable to speak through her tears. As people gradually left the town hall, Irene felt exhausted, but also lighter. The secret she had carried for 15 years was out. Some people were uncomfortable with the revelation. Some still did not fully trust her. But many had accepted her. Many had shown understanding and compassion. It was not the complete rejection she had feared. It was not the end of her life in Greendale. It was different, yes, more complicated. But possibly, in the long run, better than continuing to hide. Walking home that night, Irene looked up at the stars visible above Willow Lane. She had taken a huge risk by revealing herself. She had made herself vulnerable. She had exposed her past for everyone to see. But she had also freed herself from the burden of lying. She had stopped running. She had faced her fears. And she had survived. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, she would start restoring the payment systems. Tomorrow, she would use the skills she had hidden for so long to help her community. And tomorrow, she would do it as herself. Not as a pretend version, not as someone hiding, but as Irene Walsh, with all her complications and all her truths. It would not be easy, but it would be honest. And after 15 years of hiding, honesty felt like a kind of freedom she had forgotten existed. Friday morning brought clear skies and fresh energy. Irene woke early, as always, but this time with a sense of purpose that felt different from anything she had experienced in 15 years. She was not just getting up to go through the motions of another day. She had real work to do, important work, work that would help people. She dressed carefully, putting on slightly smarter clothes than her usual butcher shop attire. She would be working in public today, representing not just herself, but the collective hope of Greendale that things could be fixed. At 8 o'clock, Irene met Sergeant Willis at the police station. 2 other officers were there as well. They would accompany her throughout the day, observing and documenting everything she did. This was both for legal reasons and to protect her from accusations that she might be doing something inappropriate to the systems. "Ready?" Sergeant Willis asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Irene replied. They had decided to start with the high street shops, beginning with Tom's butcher shop, since Irene was most familiar with that location. Tom was waiting when they arrived, looking both nervous and excited. "Morning, everyone," he said. "Everything's ready. I've closed the shop for the day so Irene can work." Irene set up her laptop on the counter next to the SmartPay equipment. The police officers positioned themselves where they could see but would not be in the way. Then Irene took a deep breath and began. The first task was to access the system's core software. This required navigating through several security layers using techniques that Irene had not employed in 15 years. But the knowledge was still there, buried in her memory. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with increasing confidence as the old skills came back to her. "What are you doing?" one of the police officers asked, watching the code scroll across her screen. "I'm accessing the administrative interface," Irene explained. "Every system like this has a backdoor for technicians to perform maintenance and updates. The fraudsters used this same access to install their malicious code. Within an hour, Irene had full access to the system. She began methodically examining the code, identifying the components that were legitimate and those that had been added for fraudulent purposes. She explained everything she was doing to the officers, making sure they understood and could document her work. "Here," she said, pointing to several sections of code on her screen. "These modules are the fraud components. They intercept transaction data, skim small amounts from customer accounts, and route the money to external accounts. This is what we need to remove." But removing the malicious code was not as simple as just deleting it. The fraudsters had been clever. They had integrated their code deeply into the system. Removing it carelessly could break the entire payment processing functionality. Irene needed to carefully untangle the malicious components from the legitimate ones. She worked steadily through the morning, writing new code to replace the fraudulent modules, testing each change carefully, making sure nothing broke. Tom watched in fascination, occasionally bringing tea and snacks. The police officers took notes and photographs, documenting every step. By lunchtime, Irene had cleaned the butcher shop's system. She ran several test transactions, verifying that payments processed correctly without any unauthorized charges. Everything worked perfectly. "That's one down," she said, saving her work and backing up the cleaned system. "How many more shops are there in Greendale?" 43 businesses use the SmartPay systems, Sergeant Willis said. "It's going to be a long few days." "I'd better get started on the next one then," Irene said. They moved to the bakery next door. The process was similar, but each shop's system had slight variations. Some had older equipment, some had customizations. Each one required individual attention and careful work. Word spread quickly through Greendale that the restoration work had begun. People gathered outside the shops Irene was working on, watching through the windows, curious to see what she was doing. Some came inside to observe directly, asking questions about the process. Irene found herself explaining technology to people who had never thought much about how their payment systems worked. She showed them the difference between legitimate code and malicious code. She explained how the fraud had been operating in the background, invisible to shop owners and customers. People were fascinated. The mysterious world of technology, which had seemed so alien and threatening, was being made understandable by one of their own. Irene, the quiet butcher's assistant they had known for years, was revealing herself to be an expert guide through this complex digital landscape. By the end of Friday, Irene had cleaned the systems in 6 shops. It was exhausting work, requiring intense concentration. Her eyes ached from staring at code all day. Her back hurt from sitting in awkward positions. But she felt satisfied. 6 shops could now process card payments safely. 6 businesses could operate normally again. That evening, as Irene walked home, several people stopped her to say thank you. the baker whose shop she had fixed that afternoon, Mr. Davies from the newsagent whose system would be cleaned tomorrow, young people who recognized her from the town meeting. "You're doing a wonderful thing," an elderly woman told her. "My grandson runs the mobile phone shop. He's been losing so much business this week. He'll be so relieved when you fix his systems." At home, Irene made a simple dinner and then sat down with her laptop to review her work. She wanted to make sure she had not missed anything. She checked her documentation, verified her code changes, prepared for the next day's work. As she worked, she realized something had changed inside her. She was not afraid of the technology anymore. She was not haunted by painful memories when she wrote code. She was doing work that mattered, using skills that had value, helping people who needed help. The past would always be part of her. The Sentinel scandal would always be a painful memory. But it did not have to define her entire life. She could acknowledge what had happened, accept that she had been hurt, and still move forward. She could use her skills for good, even after they had been used against her. Saturday and Sunday were similar to Friday. Irene worked steadily through the shops, accompanied by police officers, observed by curious townspeople. Each system took several hours to clean properly. Each one required careful attention and methodical work. She developed a routine: arrive at a shop, set up her equipment, access the system, identify and remove malicious code, test the cleaned system, document everything, move to the next shop. The work was repetitive but satisfying. With each shop she restored, Irene felt more confident. Her technical skills, dormant for so long, were becoming sharp again. She was remembering why she had loved this work in the first place: the intellectual challenge, the problem solving, the satisfaction of making complex systems work correctly. By Sunday evening, Irene had cleaned 23 shops. She was exhausted, but pleased with the progress. More than half the businesses in Greendale could now process card payments again. Life was beginning to return to normal. Monday morning brought a surprise. When Irene arrived at the next shop on her list, the hardware store, she found a small crowd waiting outside. They applauded as she approached. Someone had brought flowers. Children held up hand-drawn thank you cards. "We wanted to show our appreciation," the hardware store owner said. "What you're doing for us, it means everything." Irene felt overwhelmed. She accepted the flowers and cards, blinking back tears. "I'm just doing what I can to help," she said. "You don't need to thank me." "Of course we do," Mrs. Henderson said, appearing from the crowd. "You stepped forward when no one else could. You used your skills to help us. That deserves recognition." Throughout Monday and Tuesday, Irene continued her work. The remaining shops were cleaned and restored. By Tuesday evening, all 43 businesses in Greendale had functioning payment systems again. The crisis was over. That night, the mayor organized a small celebration at the town hall. It was not a large event, just tea and cakes, and a chance for people to thank Irene and the police officers who had supervised the work. Mayor Thompson made a short speech. "Thanks to Irene's expertise and dedication, our community is back to normal. Businesses can operate, people can shop, life can continue. We owe her a great debt of gratitude." Sergeant Willis added, "I also want to mention that the fraud squad has recovered most of the stolen money. It will be returned to the victims within the next few weeks, and the permanent new payment systems will be installed next month. So this entire unfortunate episode is finally coming to an end. People applauded. Irene stood awkwardly, not used to being the center of attention. But she also felt proud. She had helped her community in a time of need. She had used her skills for good. She had faced her fears and had not run away. As the evening wound down, Tom Jenkins approached her. "So, does this mean you'll be leaving the butcher shop? Moving back to London? Working in technology again?" Irene had been thinking about this question. "I don't know," she admitted. "A few weeks ago, I would have said absolutely not. I had convinced myself that I never wanted anything to do with technology again. But now," she paused, "now I'm not so sure. I've remembered that I'm good at this work, and that it feels meaningful." "Well, whatever you decide," Tom said, "you'll always have a job at the butcher shop if you want it. And you'll always have a place in Greendale." "Thank you, Tom," Irene said sincerely. "That means more to me than you know." Walking home that evening, Irene thought about her future. She had spent 15 years hiding from her past, trying to be someone she was not. But the events of the past few weeks had forced her to confront that past. And in confronting it, she had discovered something important. She was still herself. Irene Walsh, the woman who had been hurt and had run away, but who was also skilled and capable and valuable. She did not have to choose between being the butcher's assistant and being the technology expert. She could be both. She could be complex and multifaceted. Her life in Greendale did not have to be about hiding anymore. It could be about living authentically, with all her history and all her skills and all her truths. The past had caught up with her, just as she had always feared it would. But instead of destroying her, it had freed her. Instead of being her enemy, it had become a tool she could use to help others. Irene smiled as she approached her cottage on Willow Lane. Tomorrow she would return to work at the butcher shop. She would serve customers and wrap meat and chat about the weather. But she would do it as herself now, fully and honestly. And if opportunities arose to use her technical skills to help the community again, she would not run from them. She would embrace them. Because she had finally learned what she should have known all along. You cannot build a meaningful life on lies and hiding. Real peace comes not from running away, but from accepting who you are and what you have experienced, and then choosing to move forward anyway. The weeks following the restoration of Greendale's payment systems brought significant changes to Irene's life, though not in the ways she had expected. The butcher shop remained her primary workplace. She continued her morning routine of arriving at 8 o'clock, preparing the display, and serving customers. But now, the conversations were different. People did not just chat about the weather anymore. They asked her opinion about technology. They brought her their computer problems. They wanted advice about online security. At first, Irene was cautious about these requests. She did not want to become the town's unofficial technical support person. But gradually, she realized that she could help people in small ways without committing to a full return to the technology industry. She started offering a weekly class at the library on understanding digital security. 15 people attended the first session, mostly older residents who wanted to learn how to protect themselves from online fraud. Irene taught them about strong passwords, phishing emails, and secure online banking. She made the complex information accessible and practical. The classes were surprisingly fulfilling. Irene enjoyed teaching. She liked making technology less frightening for people. She appreciated the questions and discussions. It was a way of using her skills that felt comfortable and meaningful. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against the SmartPay fraudsters continued. Irene was called to give evidence as an expert witness. This meant traveling to London for the first time in 15 years, a journey she had dreaded. But when she stepped off the train at King's Cross Station, Irene felt different than she had expected. Yes, London held painful memories, but she was not the same broken woman who had fled 15 years ago. She was stronger now, more settled, more confident in who she was. The court proceedings were professional and respectful. Irene explained the technical aspects of the fraud in clear terms that the jury could understand. The defense lawyers questioned her, but she answered calmly and accurately. She was not intimidated. She knew her expertise was valuable. During a break, one of the prosecutors approached her. "You did excellent work investigating this fraud, Ms. Walsh. Have you considered returning to the security field? People with your skills and integrity are always needed." "I'm not sure," Irene admitted. "I have a good life in Greendale now. I'm not certain I want to give that up." "It doesn't have to be all or nothing," the prosecutor suggested. "Many security experts work as independent consultants. They choose their projects and set their own schedules. You could do that from Greendale if you wanted." The idea intrigued Irene. She had never considered that she might work in technology again without returning to the corporate world that had hurt her. Could she really find a middle path? Back in Greendale, Irene discussed the possibility with Tom. "I don't want to leave the butcher shop," she told him, "but I'm wondering if I could do both. Work here part-time and do occasional consulting work." Tom smiled. "Irene, you've been loyal to this shop for 15 years. If you want to reduce your hours and do other work, I support that completely. In fact, my niece Sarah has been looking for a job. I could train her as your replacement for the days you're not here." So gradually, Irene began to reshape her life. She reduced her hours at the butcher shop to 3 days a week. She registered as an independent security consultant, specializing in fraud detection for small business payment systems. Her first clients were other towns that had been affected by the SmartPay fraud and wanted their systems audited by an expert. The work was challenging but manageable. Irene could conduct most of the technical analysis remotely from her cottage. When she needed to visit clients in person, the trips were short and well paid. She was careful about which projects she accepted, choosing only work that felt ethically sound and genuinely helpful. She also continued her security classes at the library, which had expanded to include topics like social media safety and protecting children online. More and more people attended, including younger residents who appreciated her clear explanations and patient teaching style. One Thursday afternoon, about 3 months after the payment system crisis, Irene was working at the butcher shop when a woman she did not recognize came in. She was in her 40s, smartly dressed in a business suit. "Are you Irene Walsh?" the woman asked. "Yes," Irene replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" "My name is Dr. Patricia Chen. I'm a professor at York University, and I run a program teaching ethical technology to computer science students. I've been following the news about your work in Greendale. I wonder if you might be interested in giving a guest lecture to my class." Irene was surprised. "A university lecture? I'm not sure I'm qualified for that." "On the contrary," Dr. Chen said, "you have exactly the kind of real-world experience my students need to hear about. They study technical skills, but they need to understand the ethical dimensions too. Your story about the Sentinel scandal and how you later used your skills to help your community, that would be incredibly valuable for them.
Irene hesitated. Talking about her past still made her uncomfortable, but she thought about those university students learning to write code and design systems. They would face ethical choices in their careers just as she had. Perhaps her experience could help them make better choices. "All right," she said slowly. "I'll do it." The lecture was scheduled for the following month. Irene spent weeks preparing, thinking carefully about what she wanted to say to young technology professionals just starting their careers. When the day came, she stood in front of a lecture hall filled with 100 students. She was nervous but determined. She began by telling them about her career at Sentinel Financial Solutions, about the pride she had taken in her work, about how she had believed she was making the world safer. Then she told them about the fraud, about how her work had been corrupted by people she trusted, about how she had been innocent but had suffered anyway, about the depression and the decision to run away. The students listened in rapt silence. "I spent 15 years hiding from who I was," Irene told them. "I convinced myself that technology was the enemy, that my skills had been a curse rather than a blessing. But I was wrong." She described the smart pay fraud in Greendale, how she had recognized what was happening, how she had investigated and exposed the criminals, how she had restored the payment systems. "What I learned is this," Irene said, looking out at the young faces. "Technology is not inherently good or evil. It's a tool. The ethics come from how we choose to use it and from the choices we make when we see it being misused." She paused to let that sink in. "Some of you in this room will create amazing things in your careers. Some of you will work on systems that affect millions of people. You'll face ethical choices. You'll see opportunities to cut corners or to exploit vulnerabilities. You'll be pressured to prioritize profit over safety." The students were completely focused on her words. "When those moments come, I want you to remember something. Your technical skills are powerful. They can be used to protect people or to harm them. They can be used to build trust or to exploit it. The choice is yours. And that choice will define not just your career, but who you are as a person." After the lecture, several students came up to thank her and ask questions. One young woman said, "Thank you for sharing your story. I've been worried about working for big corporations after university. Your talk reminded me that it's possible to use technical skills ethically, even in difficult circumstances." Dr. Chen was pleased. "That was excellent, Irene. Would you consider giving more lectures? Perhaps making this a regular thing?" Irene agreed. Over the following months, she became a regular guest speaker at York University and at other institutions. She spoke about security ethics, fraud detection, and the social responsibility of technology professionals. She found that she enjoyed teaching on this level, helping shape the thinking of the next generation. Her consulting work also grew steadily. Word spread in the technology security community about the woman in Greendale who had exposed a major fraud network. Companies sought her out for security audits and fraud prevention consultations. Irene was selective about which projects she accepted, but she found herself busier than she had been in years. One sunny Saturday in early autumn, almost a year after the smart pay crisis had begun, Irene was walking through Greendale's small park when she encountered Mrs. Henderson sitting on a bench. "Hello, Irene, dear," Mrs. Henderson called out. "Come sit with me for a moment." Irene sat down next to her. They watched children playing on the new playground equipment that had been installed with money raised by the church coffee morning. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Henderson said, "about how much things have changed this past year. For all of us, but especially for you." "It has been quite a year," Irene agreed. "You know what I admire most about you?" Mrs. Henderson continued. "You could have stayed hidden. You could have continued pretending to be someone you weren't. It would have been easier, safer. But you chose honesty instead. You chose to help people, even though it meant revealing things you had wanted to keep secret. I didn't really have a choice, Irene said. People were being hurt. I had to do something. But that's not true, is it? Mrs. Henderson said gently. You did have a choice, and you chose courage over fear. You chose service over self-protection. That's admirable, Irene. That's what real heroism looks like. Irene felt tears prick her eyes. I don't feel very heroic. I feel like I just finally did what I should have done all along. I spent 15 years running away. That's not heroic. Perhaps not, Mrs. Henderson said. But stopping running, facing your fears, using your gifts to help others, that is heroic. Don't discount what you've done, my dear. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the peaceful Saturday afternoon unfold around them. I got my money back, you know, Mrs. Henderson said. All £300. The police returned it last month. I know it's not a fortune, but at my age, every pound counts. Thank you for making that possible. I'm glad you got it back, Irene said sincerely. We all did, Mrs. Henderson continued. Mr. Thompson got his pension money back. The Fosters got their money back. Everyone who was stolen from has been made whole. That's because of you, Irene. That's something to be proud of. As Irene walked home later that afternoon, she thought about Mrs. Henderson's words. She thought about the year that had passed. She thought about the woman she had been when she fled to Greendale 15 years ago, and the woman she was now. She was not the same person. The past year had changed her. Facing her fears had changed her. Being honest had changed her. Using her skills to help others had changed her. She was still Irene Walsh, the butcher's assistant who lived in a cottage on Willow Lane. But she was also Irene Walsh, the security consultant and educator. She was also Irene Walsh, the woman who had been hurt but had found the strength to heal. She was all of these things, complex and multifaceted, and for the first time in 15 years, she was not running from any part of herself. She had integrated her past and her present. She had accepted who she was, with all her scars and all her strengths. That evening, Irene sat in her cottage and thought about the future. She had consulting projects lined up for the next 6 months. She had lecture commitments at 3 universities. She had her security classes at the library every week, and she still worked at the butcher shop 3 days a week because she enjoyed it and because it kept her connected to the community. Her life was busier than it had been, more complicated, more public, but it was also richer, more meaningful, more authentic. Irene opened her laptop, the one she had bought to investigate the SmartPay fraud, which now sat permanently on her kitchen table rather than hidden in a drawer. She had some work to prepare for a consultation next week, but before starting, she paused and looked at the screen, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. Technology was no longer her enemy. Her past was no longer a source of shame. Her skills were no longer something to hide. She had learned to use all of these things in positive ways, in ways that served others rather than serving her fears. The sun set outside her window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Irene smiled to herself. Tomorrow she would work at the butcher shop in the morning, then conduct a security audit for a client in the afternoon. Tuesday she would teach her library class. Wednesday she would give a lecture at the university. Thursday she would return to the butcher shop. It was a good life, a full life, an honest life. And after 15 years of running, Irene Walsh had finally come home. Not to a place, but to herself. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn morning, Irene stood at the front of a conference hall in Manchester. She was one of the keynote speakers at the National Fraud Prevention Conference, addressing an audience of police officers, banking security officials, and technology professionals. The invitation to speak had come 6 months earlier. At first, Irene had been reluctant. Public speaking on this scale still made her nervous, but her friend Dr. Chen had encouraged her. Your story needs to be heard by people working in fraud prevention. You have insights that could help protect countless others. So Irene had accepted, and now, looking out at the audience of hundreds of professionals, she felt both nervous and proud. "Good morning," she began. "My name is Irene Walsh, and I want to tell you about how a small town in Yorkshire helped me rediscover why I became a security architect in the first place." She told them about Greendale, about the people she had come to know over 15 years, about Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Henderson and all the others who had been victims of the smart pay fraud. She explained how recognizing the fraud had forced her to confront skills she had been hiding from. "The lesson I learned is this," Irene said. "Security is not just about technology, it's about people. Real people with real lives who are affected by our work. When we design systems, we need to think about the Mr. Thompsons of the world, elderly people on fixed incomes who cannot afford to lose even 60 pounds. We need to think about the young families like the Fosters, struggling to provide for their children. We need to think about small business owners like Tom Jenkins, whose livelihoods depend on systems they don't fully understand." She continued, "Fraud prevention is not an abstract technical challenge. It's a moral responsibility. Every vulnerability we fail to address, every security gap we choose to ignore, every warning sign we dismiss, these have real consequences for real people." The audience listened intently. After the presentation, during the question session, a young security analyst stood up. "Miss Walsh, you spent 15 years avoiding technology after the Sentinel scandal. What would you say to others in our field who have been hurt by how their work was used or misused?" Irene thought carefully before answering. "I would say that running away doesn't heal anything. It just postpones the pain. Real healing comes from facing what happened, accepting that we can't control everything, and then choosing to use our skills ethically moving forward. We can't change the past, but we can absolutely shape the future." After the conference, several people approached Irene. A police fraud investigator wanted to consult with her on a case. A banking security director wanted to hire her to audit their systems. A university wanted her to design a new course on ethical security practices. But the conversation that meant most to her was with a young woman who looked to be in her late 20s. She had tears in her eyes. "Miss Walsh," she said quietly, "I work for a financial technology company. Recently, I discovered that my manager has been implementing features that could be used for fraud. When I objected, I was told to keep quiet or lose my job. I've been so stressed not knowing what to do. Your talk today, it gave me courage. I'm going to report what's happening, whatever the consequences." Irene took the young woman's hands. "That's incredibly brave. It won't be easy, but you're doing the right thing. And remember, whatever happens, you'll be able to live with yourself. That matters more than any job." The young woman nodded gratefully and walked away. Irene watched her go, hoping she would be okay, hoping the system would protect her better than it had protected Irene herself all those years ago. On the train ride back to Greendale, Irene reflected on how far she had come. The Sentinel scandal would always be part of her history. The pain of that experience would never completely disappear, but it no longer defined her. She had used that painful experience to become someone who helped others avoid similar situations. When the train pulled into the small station near Greendale, Irene collected her bag and stepped onto the platform. The evening air was cool and fresh. The familiar sights of the town greeted her: the church spire visible in the distance, the lights of the high street, the hills surrounding the valley. She walked home to Willow Lane, greeting neighbors along the way. Mrs. Henderson was tending her garden. "Welcome back, Irene. How was your conference?" "It went well, thank you, Dorothy." "We're all very proud of you, you know, our local hero speaking at national conferences." Irene smiled. I'm just doing my part, same as everyone else in this community. At her cottage, Irene made herself a cup of tea and sat in her small living room. The room had changed over the past 2 years. There were now photographs on the walls, pictures of her standing with students after lectures, snapshots from community events in Greendale, a group photo from the fraud prevention conference. Her life was no longer devoid of connections and memories. She was building new ones, better ones. Her laptop sat on a desk in the corner, no longer hidden away but openly part of her life. Books on security and fraud prevention filled a small bookshelf. Certificates from grateful organizations hung on the wall alongside a thank you card from the young mother in Greendale whose stolen money had been recovered. This was her life now. Complicated but honest. Challenging but meaningful. Rooted in Greendale but connected to a wider world. The next morning, Irene woke at 6 o'clock, as she had done for 17 years. She made her tea, got dressed, and walked to the butcher shop for her morning shift. Tom was already there preparing for the day. "Morning, Irene. How was Manchester?" "Educational and exhausting," Irene replied with a smile. "But good." "Glad you're back. Mrs. Henderson has been asking about lamb chops all week, waiting for you to return to give your recommendations." They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing the shop for opening. The familiar rhythms of the work were soothing after the intensity of the conference. Cutting meat, arranging displays, preparing for customers, these simple tasks grounded her, reminding her of who she was at her core. At 9 o'clock, the shop opened and customers began to arrive. Mrs. Henderson was first, as she often was. "Irene, tell me all about your speech. Were you nervous? Did people appreciate what you had to say?" As Irene served lamb chops and chatted with Mrs. Henderson about the conference, she felt a deep sense of contentment. This was where she belonged. Not exclusively in the world of technology conferences and security consulting, not exclusively in the simple world of the butcher shop and small-town life, but in both, in the integration of her different selves and skills. That afternoon, after her shift ended, Irene had a video call scheduled with a client in Edinburgh. Then she would prepare for her library class tomorrow evening. On Thursday, she had another consultation. Friday, she would work at the butcher shop again. Saturday, she was speaking at a school about online safety for teenagers. Her calendar was full. Her life was busy. But it was a fullness and busyness that came from purpose, not from running away. As evening fell on Greendale, Irene sat in her cottage, completing some consultation work on her laptop. Through the window, she could see lights coming on in neighboring houses. She could hear children playing in gardens. She could see Mrs. Patterson's cat stalking along the garden wall, just as it had on the morning when Irene first opened her eyes in this cottage 17 years ago. Everything had changed, and yet, in many ways, everything was still the same. Greendale was still a small town where neighbors knew each other and cared about each other. Irene was still part of this community, still valued and accepted. The rhythms of life continued, steady and reassuring. But Irene herself had changed profoundly. She was no longer the woman running from her past. She was not hiding anymore. She was not pretending anymore. She was simply being herself. Complicated, skilled, scarred, strong, helpful, honest. She had learned that heroism was not about being fearless. It was about being afraid but doing the right thing anyway. It was about using your gifts to serve others, even when that service required sacrifice. It was about choosing truth over comfort, courage over safety, purpose over peace. The people of Greendale had called her their guardian angel. But Irene knew the truth. She was not an angel. She was just a human being who had been broken and had found the strength to heal. She was just someone who had made mistakes and had learned from them. She was just a person who had been given a second chance and had chosen to use it well. As Irene prepared for bed that night, she thought about the young security analyst from the conference, the one who had been faced with ethical choices at work. Irene hoped she would make the right decisions. She hoped she would be supported and protected. She hoped she would not have to suffer the way Irene had suffered. But even if the young woman did face difficulties, Irene hoped she would remember that setbacks were not endings. Pain was not permanent, and that sometimes the greatest growth came from the hardest experiences. Irene turned off the light and settled into bed. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new opportunities to use her skills for good. She was ready for it. Not because she was fearless, but because she had faced her fears and had survived. Not because she was confident, but because she had learned to act despite doubt. Not because she had forgotten her past, but because she had learned to integrate it into a meaningful present. Outside her window, the stars shone over Greendale. The same stars that had shone on the woman who had arrived here 17 years ago, broken and hiding. The same stars that had shone on the woman who had investigated fraud while keeping her skills secret. The same stars that now shone on Irene Walsh, security consultant, educator, butcher's assistant, and most importantly, herself. She closed her eyes and drifted toward sleep. And for the first time in many years, Irene slept peacefully, without the nightmares of the past, without the anxieties of the present, just with the quiet contentment of a woman who had finally found her place in the world, not by running to it, but by having the courage to stop running and to simply be. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.